The biggest move the Pelicans can make this offseason involves Zion Williamson, but it's not a trade. It's a position change. I'll tell you why in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, here with y'all on this Thursday, and we're going to talk about Zion Williamson moving to the three, being a small forward, playing on the wing. Does that work? Does it not? What does that solve? What does it kind of mess up? That might be the biggest move the Pelicans can make with him this offseason, and the draft is going to impact it as well. So we're going to break it all down in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the number one Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And don't forget about the free daily Locked On Pelicans newsletter. A whole ton of prizes if you subscribe right now. $2,500 Best Buy gift card, $300 Game Time gift card, or $200 to Fanatics in a gift card to get a jersey. You can subscribe over at LockedOnDaily.com. So let's get into this one. This actually came from me hanging out and talking with a bunch of other Locked On hosts. We do like a weekly, how do we call it, a water cooler, which just kind of talk for like an hour or so, just whoever wants to pop on, ask questions, how to make your show better, those sorts of things. Someone was kind of talking about, you were talking about Zion Williamson and what the Pelicans could do, and this conversation I thought was pretty interesting. So we're going to replicate it a little bit here. And that's, as we went through this season, even when they were healthy, they were a really bad defensive rebounding team. We noticed that, right? And while Zion Williamson plays the power forward, he's 6'6". You're just not going to be an elite rebounder at the power forward spot or center spot at 6'6". You can point to Charles Barkley as like, well, he was an incredible rebounder, and he was, but he is so much of an outlier compared to basically everyone else at that position, at that size, that the question is like, should we expect Zion Williamson to be a good defensive rebounder? And I think the answer is no. And it doesn't matter that it's like that's a position, that's what you've got to do. And to his credit, he was a better defensive rebounder this season than he ever has been before. But at the same point, that's not going to get it done for this team. They are currently 27th when it comes to defensive rebounding percentage. And at times, they've been 30th and 30th by like a mile, like a literal, and David Griffin has even said this, historically bad defensive rebounding team. And that has killed them. That has really hurt their defense in a variety of ways this season. And that's why this defense, which has been good the past couple of years, is currently ranked 29 out of 30. So that is a problem. You got to get that fixed next year. The offense needs to get better too, but the defense has been good, fell off a cliff this year, and a big part of that has to do with the defensive rebounding. So what if you go, and the Pelicans were experimenting a good bit with this year, of moving Zion to the small forward spot, put him on the wing, play him as a three, which is more of his style anyway, truthfully. And then you play with two big men. And does that then solve some of the rebounding issues? And while that sounds good in theory, and there are reasons to look at putting Zion at the wing, I think that would be a big move that could open things up. And when you factor into injuries earlier on in this year, that the team is going to have, or next year that the team is going to have, maybe Zion at the three makes a ton of sense. If Trey or Herb, one or both, are not ready for the start of the regular season, maybe Zion does need to be playing the wing here. But this also might depend on what you do at the center position. So while Zion at the three sounds great, you could put CJ in there, say CJ, Trey Murphy, Zion, and then your two bigs. What's going to matter is the two big men that you have. And we'll get into that more in the next segment here. But let's look at Zion at the three and just kind of focus on that, right? he's not like a traditional back to the basket big man. When you watch him play, it's more like a guard. It's more like a wing. The driving from the 3-point line when he gets a full head of steam, basically being unstoppable when it comes to that sort of thing. Defensively, he's not great guarding elite big men. He doesn't have the size to really contest them. The strength is certainly there, and he does what he can, and he has moments, but is he better with some of the athleticism that he has guarding guys on the wing and kind of taking on smaller defenders who maybe don't have the strength to back him down or bully him? And could that work? And I think we've seen it. And if he's playing on the wing a little bit or a little bit more in space, does that allow him to roam a little bit? One of the biggest things about Zion Williamson defensively, I think, is his knack for just knowing when to go for the ball, intercepting passes, getting off and running all the way down. That seems like a very good way for him to play. You're going to do more of that at the wing than being kind of down below the basket where maybe it's a defensive liability at that point in time. So it can, in theory, we'll get to that more in a minute, help you with some of that next season. I think you can maybe improve the defense. In theory, your rebounding gets better because you have two other taller guys out there on the court. Now, all of a sudden, size, length is not a big liability that it has been for the Pelicans this season. And with Zion Williamson and the way he wants to play, which is kind of facilitating, right? He's been playing more like a wing, more like a point guard this year too. When you watched him play and he was dealing, he's had a triple-double now. He's come close a number of times with the passing. He looks really good. You don't want him with his back to the basket acting like a traditional big man. There's still plays for him like that where he's kind of posting up and he does a very good seal, can spin, turn, and immediately score with a layup because finishing off the glass is a specialty of his. So you put him on the wing, you allow him to play that way. And I think that makes a ton of sense. Maybe it means you can kind of get him in a little bit more space, and it gives him sometimes more post-up opportunities where if they put a wing on him, he can back them down and try and score over them that way with the strength that he has. So moving Zion to the 3 there makes a ton of sense. And they, as I said, experimented with that a bunch this year. When you look at Zion Williamson and the positions that he's played this year, primarily it's been power forward. This is an estimate according to Basketball Reference. He played the center spot 8% of the time, power forward 61% of the time, and then the small forward spot 32% of the time. That is more than he's ever done it before in his career. The next closest time that he played that much kind of at the 3 was, it's only been 2 other years where he gets anything that counts in there. It's 1% of the time. By and large, he plays the majority of his time at the power forward spot, but I think the Pelicans realized with the defensive rebounding issues that they had, let's move him to the wing. In theory, it solves it, right? Well, not so fast. There are some downsides to putting him at the 3 that I want to look at, even if maybe that's a more natural position for him. Let's look at what those downsides are coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. All so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Prize Picks. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. And it's really easy because with Prize Picks, you just pick more or less on at least 2 player projections. And if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. So whether it's strikeouts, RBIs, or first inning runs, Prize Picks keeps every game exciting. So this week, I'm picking Aaron Judge for more than 1 home run and Shohei Ohtani for more than 1 stolen base. Like I said, it's really that easy. And setting your lineup takes less than 60 seconds, and when you win, your payout is quick, safe, and secure. So take advantage of the different offers they have out there, the different promos they have to win even more money. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNBA for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And don't forget about the free daily Locked On Pelicans newsletter. Look, this season's over. Playoffs are out of reach, but this offseason is massively important. We're going to have a ton of draft coverage, all of that. We've been doing that here. If you subscribe to Locked On Pelicans, not only do you keep up to date with the team, but you could win some big prizes if you subscribe now through April 30th, 2025. A $2,500 Best Buy gift card to upgrade your viewing experience, a $300 Game Time gift card, or a $200 Fanatics gift card. Buy yourself a jersey. Get exclusive insight into free agency, draft coverage, and Pelicans updates delivered straight to your inbox. Subscribe by clicking on the link in the description down below or over at LockedOnDaily.com for the Locked On Pelicans daily newsletter. All right, let's keep talking about Zion at the 3. We went over some of the benefits and why it just seems to make sense. And I think it does. And the Pelicans, for that reason, tried it a bunch this year. But here's the thing. I don't know if it had the results you want, but I'm not sure that that's Zion's fault here. So I went and pulled basically all the lineups. This is per Cleaning the Glass. If you want like just my favorite stats website, it's cleaningtheglass.com. It's like $50 a year. It's like so worth it in my opinion. Zion Williamson at the 3. Give me all of the lineups where he played at the 3 and what the numbers and the data are on them. And admittedly, it's not the biggest sample size. It's not a horrifically small sample size either. It's about 546 possessions, but it had a negative net rating of minus 7.4. Had an offensive rating of 113.7. That's not good. It's about middle of the pack in the league. And an awful defensive rating of 121.2. Like, those are just the overall numbers. And yeah, that ain't going to get it done whatsoever. That's, let me see, better than the Pelicans' offensive rating and a worse defensive rating, and they're 29th in the league. Like, that's just simply not going to work, right? But I don't know if that's Zion's fault. You know, one of the things we talked about putting Zion at the 3 for is supposed to solve some of the defensive rebounding issues. But truthfully, when you look at their defensive rebounding rate, defensive rebounding percentage with Zion at the 3, well, it's not good. It's 71.5. Like, is that better or worse than what their overall average is this year? It's worse than what their overall average is this year, which is 72.7. That basically means they're grabbing 72.7% of all available defensive rebounds. That's 27th in the league. And this number is worse than that. Somewhat small sample size when it comes to that, so keep that in mind. But also when you look at some of the lineups he was in, yeah, maybe those weren't going to be good defensive rebounding-ish lineups because of the big men you have, right? The 2 most used lineups where Zion is at the 3, you know, the first one is CJ McCollum, Trey Murphy, Zion Williamson, Kelly Olynyk, and Yves Missi. Look, Olynyk's a fine enough defensive rebounder, but he's not elite. Missi is not particularly great at that either. So, yeah, they're in the 28th percentile when it comes to defensive rebounding percentage. It's not a good number. When you look at the other most used lineup, sub out Kelly Olynyk and put in Carlo Makovic. So it's CJ, Trey, Zion, Carlo, and Missi. And that has a bad defensive rebounding lineup too. Makovic just isn't there yet. Could be. You know, Missi again is kind of consistent there. That's not particularly great. Like, that is influencing this sort of thing, and it doesn't really work. So the early returns of like, well, if you put him there, that'll help with the defensive rebounding. Yeah, if you upgrade both your bigs. And I remember talking about this with Antonio Daniels and Will Guillory at a game earlier in the season when we were kind of talking about like, what do you do? How do you fix some of these things? Just kind of just discussing things. It's fun. And, you know, Antonio Daniels at the time was like, yeah, I think Zion, you know, you put him at the 3. And Will's immediate reaction to this was like, are your bigs still going to be Kelly Olynyk and Yves Missi? Because if that's the case, I don't think that's going to work, and I'm not sure you're going to even be a play-in team when it comes to that sort of thing. So the idea of Zion at the 3 sounds great, but it might be more important to upgrade the big men than it would be simply moving Zion Williamson to a different position and rolling with what you have if what you have just isn't that good. Look, Kelly Olynyk is fine. Fine. Same with Yves Missi. Fine. But that's not going to get you into the playoffs. That's not going to make noise in the playoffs either. That's probably a play-in tournament team with the other talent that they have, but still has some of the same issues we've seen this year. And moving Zion to the 3 just hasn't shown it. Now, there are some lineups where it doesn't look bad for whatever reason. And again, small sample size, this is 48 possessions, right? Jose Alvarado, Jordan Hawkins, Zion Williamson, Kelly Olynyk, Carlo Makovic, plus 43 in terms of net rating. They were a very good at that point defensive rebounding team, just a very good defensive rebounding team, defensive team in general. So that's such a small sample size that you're not going to hold teams to a 63.3 defensive rating, right? Like when the average of these type of lineups is 121.2, it's basically cutting that in half. Like that's not it. That's not a sustainable thing. And their offense wasn't good in that lineup either. So it really comes down to maybe you need to improve the bigs. And maybe that's the key to the offseason here. That might mean that if you get a better center, say a Jared Allen or something like that, that you could put Zion Williamson at the 4. And then this leads into another problem that Zion at the 3 potentially creates. And that is, does this stop you from getting your best players all out there on the court at the same time? And it really might. And let's just go off guys that we maybe expect to be healthy this season. Because when you look at someone like Trey Murphy is very much not a 4, right? Like not a 4 really at all. He's much more of a 3 here. So if you're playing Zion Williamson at the 3, and then you need to have 2 bigs, so let's just put center and power forward. It doesn't really matter who they are, right? Because everyone else at those 2 positions, as of now on the Pelicans roster, is not, right? Would that be safe to say, is not going to be like an elite player of who they have. So those 2 things can just kind of be there, and that's fine. How do you fill the other 2 positions? CJ is going to be healthy to start the year. Let's say Herb Jones is too. Let's say Trey Murphy III is as well. And eventually DeJounte Murray is going to come back. But you have 2 positions left, 2 slots to fill, and 3 guys. So you're not maximizing putting your best players out there on the court. Would it be better to go CJ McCollum, Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, Zion Williamson, and then whatever center that you want? So while maybe the 3 is a more natural position for Zion Williamson, and again, in theory, makes sense for playing him there, is that something you can do if you really want to kind of put your guys out there on the court in the best way possible? And I'm not exactly sure that it is. Now, Trey does play some of the 4, right? Like that's not an uncommon thing to do, and maybe he can grow in there. There's good size. And you've seen the leaps that he has made this year in terms of strength, in terms of trying to be a better defensive rebounder than he's been in the past here too. But he's not a lead at that sort of thing, right? And so is that going to actually kind of fix the problem? I'm looking at Trey Murphy at the 4. It's about 1,000, almost 1,100 possessions, right? I don't want to read too much into the net rating because no one was good this year on the team. There's very few of those, right? But the defensive rebounding rate's bad. Like it's still a bad number. It's a 6th percentile with him there. And that's going to include some lineups with him and Zion Williamson. So, how do you kind of sort this out and figure this out is a bit of a conundrum, let's call it, for New Orleans with the way the current roster is. Now, you can remake the current roster. They're certainly going to try. And I would imagine that they are going to try and upgrade the center position, via trade this offseason. They've tried the past couple of years. They haven't been able to find a deal that works, though certainly they've been kicking the tires on everybody when it comes to that sort of thing. But that is what you've got to try and figure out and what their long-term, short-term challenge is when it comes to this sort of thing. So the biggest move they could make would be putting Zion at the 3, but that really would only work if you upgrade the center position or your big man rotation overall, because all of a sudden you're removing Zion from that equation. He would still play there some. But if you start him at the 3, you do need that other big man there, and it doesn't just fix itself by putting 2 mid bigs. I don't mean that in a negative way. You get what I'm saying. Putting 2 average players in there does not create like a good player or something like that. It just puts 2 average players out there on the court, and that's not what is going to solve this for New Orleans. Now, look, maybe the draft factors into this as well. Let's look at how that could kind of change things. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by DoorDash. NBA fans, get ready. They swoosh, you save. Thanks to Dash Pass, every time a player drops 50 or more points in a game, you score a huge deal the next day. And it's really simple. When any player scores 50 or more in a game during the 2024-2025 NBA regular season, Dash Pass members get 50% off and order up to $10 off the next day from noon until midnight. So after an epic 50-point performance, celebrate by ordering wings, pizza, or burgers from your favorite spot delivered right to your door. Do you need a quick and easy lunch the next day? With Dash Pass, you can get your favorite meals with $0 delivery fees and reduced service fees. Plus, now you save even more with this exclusive NBA offer. So sign up for Dash Pass and be ready to save. When any player scores 50 or more in a game, Dash Pass members get 50% off and order the next day, up to $10 off. Just use promo code NBA50 from noon to midnight after a 50-point game on eligible orders at participating merchants. Must have an active Dash Pass account. Terms apply. Visit DoorDash to learn more. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. And of course, make Locked On Saints your second listen today. There's a lot of smoke about a QB, and I am excited about that. So go over to Locked On Saints. Is that what they're going to do? Shedeur Sanders, anybody? I could be sold on that so easily. Anyone other than Derek Carr. Not anyone, but almost anyone other than Derek Carr. Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints, making sense of everything black and gold, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's keep talking about Zion at the 3 and how the draft might impact that too. Because look, if you end up in one of these, it goes to the problem that I just spoke about in the last segment of, are you going to be able to maximize your lineup, your roster, by getting your best players on the court at any given time? And I think the Pelicans, if they move Zion to the 3, you're essentially reserving 2 spots for guys that just aren't worthy of being in that. One of them, you just might have to play out of necessity, but 2 feels like you're hurting yourself to force a positional fit or something like that. And that's probably not the way to go about it. That sounds a good way to be just a middling team, in my opinion. But the draft might also change some of this, right? If all of a sudden the Pelicans fall a little bit in the draft, 5, 6, 7, somewhere in that range, and you're looking at someone like Derek Queen or Kaman Malawach, those guys should be difference makers and at least able to contribute kind of right away at the NBA level. And so all of a sudden, if those guys can get some minutes, maybe it doesn't start that way, but there are lineups that can be effective with Zion Williamson at the 3. And I think that's something that can be pretty exciting here. Look, if you move up in the draft and you end up #1 overall with Cooper Flagg, he's going to be starting for this team. And maybe that does mean you put Zion Williamson at the 4 to put Cooper Flagg at the 3 to kind of save him. But he's also 6'9". He can play the 4. So does that change it then? And does all of a sudden he become your 4? And given that he's not a bad rebounder and just kind of does everything, right? It feels like, does that open things up a little bit more for this team and allow you to play him in, different lineups or move Zion wherever he needs to be? If your starting lineup, can it be something like, and you can argue the little positions here of CJ McCollum, we're going to go off guys that are healthy. Let's say Herb Jones, Zion Williamson, Cooper Flagg, and Messi, or Zion Williamson, Cooper Flagg, and Olynyk. Could you then even still add Jarrett Allen? And could your starting lineup be CJ, Herb, or Trey, Zion, Flagg, and Jarrett Allen? I think those are all realistic possibilities. And all of a sudden, putting Zion at the 3 makes more sense. We're talking about this today on the show, but with an incomplete picture of what the offseason looks like, right? I don't think you want to go into the offseason of, we're forcing Zion to the 3, we're going to make it work around that. That seems like a good way to make bad decisions and short-sighted decisions. But sometimes these kind of natural solutions just appear and they show themselves to you. And you got to listen and follow that sort of thing. Cooper Flagg could do that. If you end up 3 and you take Ace Bailey, who's very much, a 3, do you put him there? Do you put someone like, him at the 3 or even a little bit at the 4? Where he played somewhat, but he's much more like a scoring 3 and that sort of thing. So these are all things that you look at with him and it's like, oh yeah, that could work. I wouldn't probably put Ace Bailey at the 4. He's not a good enough rebounder, in my opinion, or defensive rebounder to make that work. Much more of a score. Put him there where you don't need to worry about some of that stuff. But he's also a defensive liability at times, so we'll see. But he's got good size at 6'10". These are the type of dilemmas, decisions that the Pelicans are going to have to kind of explore and look at this offseason with guys, and how it could just kind of change things a little bit. Does VJ Edgecombe come in and he's a pretty good rebounder for the 2 position? Does that maybe change how you view this? And you kind of spend more effort on defensive rebounding, team defensive rebounding, than you would otherwise. But given that we knew defensive rebounding was going to be a problem this year for the Pelicans, it feels like you can't ignore it again. And that this is something you do need to address this offseason. And I think they're very aware of it. David Griffin, in some of his media availability, basically did say, I'm aware that this is a team that is a historically bad rebounding team. We need to get better in that area. So I would imagine this is one of the things that they are really going to be looking to address. And even though they, drafted a center in the first round this year, and he's played well for, what the expectations are, I wouldn't be shocked if they still try and take that same approach. It doesn't preclude them from drafting another center again if that's the type of guy that makes the most sense. And I think it's just TBD on where they end up in the draft, but that's going to probably have a big impact on what they end up doing this offseason. So that makes things kind of still open. And like I said, we're kind of trying to answer this question, but right now it is a little bit incomplete, or we're missing a lot of information that really fits it. But I do think moving Zion to the 3, depending on other moves you make, could really open things up in a very positive way for New Orleans. Make Zion a better player, let him kind of run the team till you get a point guard back, because he was dishing and dealing and looked real good when it came to that. Does that allow him to do even more of that? And I think it would if you put him on the wing. So those are the type of decisions that the Pelicans front office is going to be looking at this offseason that I think could make a pretty significant impact on how they want to do things and what it could be for them next year. So we'll see what they end up doing. But overall, they've got some flexibility, some creativity too, and the draft might impact what it does. And that's truthfully probably the better way to go about this is draft who you're going to draft, do the best with the roster you've got rather than trying to force square peg into a round hole and, any other sort of idioms that you could use when it comes to this sort of thing. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. What do you think about Zion Williamson at the 3? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Be back with y'all tomorrow, recap the game, and talk a little bit more draft.